Okay, so when you think about cities, what's the first thing that jumps into your head? Is it, the endless traffic?
Oh, definitely traffic for many people. Or just the crowds.
Yeah, the sheer number of people. Or maybe it's worries about pollution, smog, or seeing those really stark images of inequality like slums right next to
Those
skyscrapers.
are powerful images, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's really easy to focus on what people often call the urban diseases, isn't it?
It is. All those problems we tend to associate with lots of people living close together. It kind of makes you wonder, is packing ourselves in like this really the best way to live?
Well, those negative perceptions are strong, and they've definitely shaped how we think about cities for, well, for ages.
Right. They lead to arguments about limiting how much cities grow, maybe encouraging people to spread out more, back to the land sort of thing.
Yeah, that romantic idea of escaping the city. It's a narrative that's deeply ingrained.
Absolutely, but what if? What if that whole narrative, while it points to some real issues, is actually missing the bigger picture? What if cities aren't the source of our problems, but maybe humanity's best tool for progress?
Now that's the really provocative idea at the heart of what we're digging into today. We're exploring the core arguments from a book called The Triumph of the City. It's by Edward Glaeser.
He's a Harvard professor, right? Big name in urban economics.
That's him. And his work presents a fundamentally different way of looking at cities and why they're so important.
And his main point isn't exactly subtle, is it? He basically argues that cities aren't just, one of our achievements, but maybe humanity's greatest invention, full stop.
He does. He argues they're absolutely key for creating wealth, for fostering knowledge, even for environmental sustainability, believe it or not, and for health and happiness too.
Wow, so it's a direct challenge to all those anti-city feelings we started with.
A very direct challenge. He's not glossing over the problems, definitely not. But his argument is that many criticisms come from maybe a misunderstanding of how cities work, or they point to problems that cities are actually uniquely suited to solve.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our mission for this deep dive is to really get into the main arguments from the sources we have. We want to look closely at those common prejudices against cities,
Mm-hmm.
understand the maybe surprising benefits cities offer,
Right.
and then explore why some cities seem to stumble while others thrive or even come back from the brink. We'll stick closely to the details and examples in our source material.
Sounds good. And I think to really grasp the triumph part, we have to first face those perceived diseases head on and maybe rethink them.
Exactly. So let's start there. Part one, challenging that urban diseases narrative. Like you said, this idea that cities are inherently plagued by problems leads people to think we should limit their growth.
Yeah, spread out. It's better.
Right. So before we get to the benefits, we need to look critically at these common complaints, using Glazer's arguments, and see if they hold up.
Okay, where should we start? What are the most visible issues, maybe? Slums and poverty.
Good one. The perception is stark, isn't it? Cities as places of deep inequality. You think of places like, historically, Kallenwalled City or huge informal areas in Mumbai, Rio, Lagos.
Yeah, images of extreme poverty, terrible conditions, overcrowding, no basic services, makeshift housing. It looks like hopelessness.
And sometimes the data seems to back that up. Our source mentions a U.S. comparison showing city poverty rates around, 17.7% versus 9.8% in the suburbs.
Right, so on the surface, it looks like cities just inherently have more poverty, almost double the rate in that example.
Seems pretty clear-cut, but the source argues that comparison is, maybe misleading.
It argues it's incomplete, yeah, because just comparing poverty rates inside the city to outside doesn't ask the crucial question. Why are those poor people in the city in the first place?
Okay. So it's not just that they're poor, but why they're there.
Exactly. People often move to cities because they offer some hope, some potential for a better life, opportunities they simply didn't have where they came from, which is often rural areas with even deeper poverty.
So Glazer's point, according to the source, is we shouldn't compare slum dwellers to, say, middle-class suburbanites. We should compare them to people who stayed behind in those rural areas.
That's the argument. Compare them to their counterparts back home. And when you do that, the picture often changes dramatically.
Okay, how so? Does the source give examples?
It does. It mentions Rio de Janeiro back in 1996.
Yeah.
Even in the poorer urban areas, something like 90% of residents were earning over $85 a month.
Okay.
Now compare that to rural Northeast Brazil at the same time.
Yeah.
Only about 30% earn that much. That's a huge difference in economic opportunity, even if city life was still very tough.
Wow, 3 times the rate.
Yeah. And similarly, in Lagos, Nigeria, Despite the visible poverty, the extreme poverty rate in the city was apparently half what it was in rural Nigeria.
Okay, that really flips the script. So the fact that there are poor people in cities isn't proof the city made them poor.
Exactly. It's often evidence that the city attracted them because it represented some kind of hope, some chance, however slim, for improvement. The city is seen as a place of opportunity, even if arriving there means starting at the very bottom.
It's just the city is a magnet for ambition, maybe.
That's a good way to put it. And the source makes another really important point here.
Yeah.
These slums, these informal settlements,
Hmm.
they aren't always dead ends.
Right, they can be temporary.
For many, yes.
Mm.
They function as a sort of entry point, a first step on the ladder.
Mm.
The term arrival city captures this idea well. It's where migrants get a foothold. Maybe the first generation struggles, but their kids get access to city schools, city networks, city jobs.
And they have a chance to move into the middle class, perhaps.
That's the hope, and often the reality over time. Staying in a remote village might feel safer or less stressful in some ways, but it can also mean being stuck in generational poverty with almost no way out. The city, even the slum, offers a potential pathway.
This also makes me think about immigration. It's often seen as a burden on cities, straining services and infrastructure.
It definitely does present challenges, no question. Managing rapid influxes is hard. But the source argues that immigration is also a massive source of vitality, diversity, and new energy for cities.
So trying to limit immigration to ease those strains might actually hurt the city in the long run.
That's the argument Glazer makes. Rejecting immigrants, who are often highly motivated and entrepreneurial, means limiting the city's future dynamism and potential. It's a trade-off.
Okay, that's a really different perspective on urban poverty and slums. What about the next big worry? Pollution and health. The smog, the stress. And historically, cities were death traps, weren't they? Disease hotbeds.
Absolutely. For centuries, cities were incredibly unhealthy. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, they were breeding grounds for epidemics. The source mentions Mumbai having lower life expectancy, issues with sanitation, TB. That's historically accurate for many places.
So how does Glazer counter that?
He argues that cities can be healthy, incredibly healthy in fact, but it's not automatic. Health in cities is an achievement. It requires deliberate effort, investment, and public action.
Like what happened in New York City, I remember reading about that.
Exactly. The source uses NYC as a prime example. Early 20th century, male life expectancy was dismal, like 7 years below the national average, mostly due to infectious diseases just running rampant.
So what did they do?
They took massive steps. They paved the streets often with asphalt, which cut down dramatically on mud, dust, and filth that harbored germs. They built huge, clean, public water systems. They implemented proper sewage and sanitation infrastructure. Big collective public health projects.
And did it work?
Dramatically. The source says male life expectancy in New York shot up by almost 5 years in just 1 decade. That's incredible.
Wow. That really shows it's not density itself that's the problem, but the lack of infrastructure to support that density.
Precisely. And here's the twist. The high density that seems like it would cause health problems actually makes providing these large-scale public health solutions, clean water, sewers, even hospitals, cheaper and more efficient per person.
Ah, economies of scale again.
Exactly. So today, in developed countries, people living in dense cities often have longer life expectancies than people in rural areas.
Really? Why?
Better access to doctors, specialists, hospitals, emergency services, public health campaigns. It's just easier and cheaper to deliver high-quality services to a concentrated population. So density isn't the enemy of health. It can actually be an ally if the right investments are made. Health is a collective urban achievement.
Okay, that's powerful. Let's move on to crime. The common wisdom is pretty simple. Poverty breeds crime. Cities have poverty, therefore cities have high crime. Seems logical.
It seems logical, but again, the source suggests the direct link isn't always that strong or simple. Poverty is a huge challenge, yes, but it's not always the main driver of crime rates.
How so?
Well, the source uses Mumbai's slums again. Despite the intense poverty, their overall crime rate is actually lower than the average for all Indian cities.
That is surprising. So if it's not just poverty, what else influences urban crime rates, according to the source?
It suggests other factors are often more significant. Things like demographics, a large population of young men, for instance, or the anonymity that can come with living in a huge city where you don't know your neighbors. Socioeconomic factors like the prevalence of single-parent households are also mentioned.
So, more complex social and demographic factors.
Yes, and crucially, the source argues that crime rates are heavily influenced by deliberate policies and social changes. It points to the big drop in crime in many U.S. cities in the late 20th century.
What caused that?
A whole mix of things, some still debated. The source mentions factors like, controversially, the effects of abortion legalization decades earlier, potentially reducing the number of young men at risk, but also more direct things like falling unemployment rates and, significantly, increases in community policing and interaction, things that build social cohesion.
So, like health, crime isn't seen as just an unavoidable part of being urban.
Not unavoidable, no. It's presented as a complex social problem influenced by many things, but one that can be tackled with smart policies and community efforts. Again, the density of cities might even make some interventions, like targeted policing or community programs, easier to implement effectively.
Okay, let's tackle the environment. This is a big one. Cities as concrete jungles, unnatural, bad for the planet. There's that whole romantic idea, like Thoreau at Walden Pond, that escaping to nature is the truly green thing to do.
Right, the wall, the myth. The source goes right after that one.
Hmm.
It argues that, maybe counterintuitively, if you look at the environmental impact per person, dense cities are actually surprisingly green.
How on earth can a concrete jungle be greener than living in the woods?
Well, first, the source kind of debunks the Thoreau myth a bit. Points out he wasn't really isolated, he went into town for supplies, relied on city contacts, and oh yeah, he accidentally started a big forest fire.
Huh, okay,
Yeah.
fair enough. But the core point about cities being greener.
It comes down to efficiency, driven by density. Think about heating and cooling. Living in an apartment or townhouse with shared walls uses way less energy per person than heating or cooling a big, detached single-family house in the suburbs or countryside.
Okay, shared walls, less heat loss. Makes sense.
And then there's transportation. This is huge. City dwellers, especially in dense areas, drive much less. They can walk, bike, or take public transit for work, shopping, errands. Suburban and rural life is almost completely car-dependent. That's a massive difference in carbon footprint per person.
Right, all those individual car trips add up enormously.
Enormously. And it's not just personal travel. Providing services is way more efficient in cities. Think about garbage collection, water lines, electricity grids, internet cables. It takes far fewer resources, pipes, wires, trucks, fuel, to serve 1,000 people in a city block than 1,000 people spread out over miles of countryside.
So the infrastructure itself is less resource intensive per person.
Vastly. So that romantic idea of everyone enjoying their own piece of nature spread out is actually quite environmentally costly when you factor in the infrastructure and travel required.
This really challenges the image of the leafy green suburb, doesn't it?
It does. Suburbs look green with the lawns and trees. But the source argues the lifestyle they enable, larger homes, multiple cars, long commutes, leads to much higher per capita energy consumption and carbon emissions compared to dense urban living.
Okay, let me get this straight. If you're an environmentalist and your main concern is, say, climate change and reducing your carbon footprint.
Then, according to Glazer's argument in the source, you should ideally be living in a dense urban neighborhood. Your personal environmental impact is likely to be significantly lower there than in a sprawling suburb or a rural area. It's all about that per capita efficiency.
That is a really powerful counterintuitive point. Okay, one last bias. The idea that cities destroy history and beauty. That developers just tear down charming old buildings to put up ugly, soulless skyscrapers, and that only places like Paris that fiercely protect their history get it right.
It's an understandable sentiment. Historic city centers can be incredibly beautiful, and losing old buildings feels like losing character. But the source argues that prioritizing preservation above all else, especially by strictly limiting building heights and density, comes with really significant costs.
Costs beyond just losing potential new buildings.
Yeah, social economic costs.
Yeah.
Costs that affect who actually gets to live in this city.
Yeah.
Paris is the prime example used. Its beauty is undeniable, thanks in large part to strong preservation rules.
Right.
But those same rules severely limit the supply of new housing in a place everyone wants to be. The result? Astronomical housing costs. The source mentions hotels over $500 a night, but that reflects the insane cost of apartments and living there generally.
So who can afford to live there?
Increasingly only the very wealthy. The source argues this kind of extreme preservation effectively excludes ordinary people, the middle class, students, artists, immigrants. It preserves the buildings but can hollow out the diverse human life within them. It turns the city center into a beautiful museum or a boutique for the rich.
The struggling artist in a Paris attic, that's more myth than reality now.
Much harder to achieve today, certainly. They simply can't afford the rent. And this leads to the defense of the skyscraper.
The villain in the preservationist narrative.
Right. But the source argues they're not just ugly boxes. They're a practical response to the reality of limited land and high-demand areas. Building up is the most efficient way to create more space homes, offices on a small footprint.
And more space means.
More supply helps keep prices from skyrocketing quite as much. It allows more people, a wider range of people, to live and work near the city center, near the opportunities,
So it's a trade-off, maybe sacrificing some of the historical look or lower skyline.
in exchange for allowing more people, more diversity, more economic activity to be concentrated in the core.
Ugh.
That's the argument. Because according to Glazer, it's that concentration of diverse people interacting that fuels the city's real magic, its dynamism, its creativity.
So protecting old buildings is important, but if you do it too rigidly, you might choke off the supply of housing, drive up costs, and prevent the very newcomers and diverse populations that keep a city alive from being able to move in.
That's the potential downside highlighted in the source. Finding the right balance is key. Honoring history without freezing the city in time and making it unaffordable.
Okay, so pulling this first part together, it seems like Glazer's argument, as presented here, is that many of the things we see as inherent flaws of cities' poverty, health issues, crime, environmental damage, loss of history are either misunderstood or they're challenges that cities are actually well equipped to handle, often through the very density that seems to cause the problem.
Right. The presence of poverty might signal opportunity. Health issues can be solved with dense infrastructure. Crime is complex but influenced by policy. Density can be environmentally efficient. And development allows more people access. It's about focusing on making cities work better, not trying to stop them from being cities.
That's a really solid reframing of the challenges. Okay, let's pivot then. Let's look directly at the positive side, the triumph part. Why do people flock to cities? What are the fundamental benefits? The source starts this by tackling a pretty famous idea.
Yeah, the world is flat idea. From Thomas Friedman. The notion that technology, the internet, globalization, it was all making geography irrelevant. Distance was dead.
Right. But this book argues completely the opposite.
Completely. It says the world is not flat at all, it's spiky.
Spiky? What does that mean?
It's a great visual. And think of the world map. Most of it is relatively flat, low-density countryside, but then you have these sharp peaks, these spikes of intense concentration population, economic activity, innovation. Those spikes are cities and their surrounding regions.
And these spikes dominate.
Hugely. The source argues that despite taking up a tiny percentage of the Earth's land, maybe 1.5% globally, these urban spikes account for a massive, disproportionate share of everything important.
Like the China example you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Globally, half the world's economic activity happens on that tiny 1.5% of land. In China, the top 10 city clusters were on just 15% of the land but held nearly half the population and generated over 70% of the GDP. And basically all major innovation, all significant knowledge creation, it happens in cities. The world isn't flat. It's incredibly concentrated on these urban spikes.
So that density, that concentration, isn't just a side effect. The source argues it's the actual engine driving success.
That's the core argument. High population density is the key ingredient. And Glazer says it works its magic through three main mechanisms: sharing, matching, and learning.
Okay, sharing, matching, learning. Let's break those down. Sharing first. How does being close together help us share?
Well, the most obvious way is sharing the cost of really big, expensive things. Think infrastructure or cultural amenities, an opera house, a major museum, a giant sports stadium, a complex subway system. These things cost a fortune to build and run.
Right, you need a lot of people to pay for them.
Exactly. Only a large, dense population can provide enough users, patrons, taxpayers to make these things financially viable. The fixed costs get spread across millions. You simply can't support that kind of thing in a small town or rural area. Density enables shared access to high-cost amenities.
Makes sense for big buildings. Does it apply to people's skills too?
Absolutely. Sharing also enables extreme specialization of labor. High density creates a large enough market for people with very niche skills to make a living and hone their craft.
Like the eye doctor example.
Perfect example from the source. Imagine a doctor who specializes in a super rare eye condition. The training is immense. In a small town, they might see one case a year. They can't sustain a practice or become a true expert. But in a city of millions, they can find enough patients to build a practice, become incredibly skilled through constant experience, and provide that specialized care. The cost of developing that expertise is effectively shared by the large pool of potential patients.
And the source also mentioned this turns luxury into access.
Yeah, that's a neat point. Think about skills that used to be only for the rich, like having a private chef or a personal tailor. In a city, those specialized skills become services available to many more people. You can go to a restaurant with a highly trained chef, or visit a skilled bartender, or find a specialist repair person. Density creates a market that makes these specialized services accessible, benefiting both the consumer and the skilled professional who gets to practice and refine their craft.
Okay, so sharing is about pooling costs for amenities and supporting specialized skills. What about matching?
Matching is all about increasing the odds of finding the right connection. Because there are just so many more people packed together, the pool of potential matches for anything is vastly larger.
The source used dating as the obvious example, right?
It did, and it makes the point clearly. If you're single and looking for a partner, the sheer number of other single people in a city, encountered in bars, parks, workplaces, just increases the statistical probability of meeting someone you click with. More options improve the chances of a good match.
But it's much broader than just
Oh,
romance.
much broader. It's about finding your tribe, finding people who share your specific interests, your profession, your background, your hobbies, whatever it is.
Like the cosplay example.
Yeah, that's a good illustration from the source. If your passion is something niche, maybe only 1 in 1,000 people share it. In a town of 10,000, that's just 10 people. Hard to form a community, maybe even hard to find them. But in a city of 10 million, that's 10,000 potential fellow enthusiasts.
Enough to support clubs, shops, conventions.
Exactly. Enough to build a real community, support businesses, feel like you belong. Cities make it much easier for people with minority interests or identities to find each other and connect. It counters isolation.
So matching significantly boosts our ability to find the right people for jobs, friendships, romance, shared interests, just by increasing the number of possibilities.
That's the idea. And this connects directly to the third mechanism, which the source argues is the most important one,
Yeah.
learning.
Learning.
Right.
How does density facilitate learning better than, say, online courses or books?
This is where it gets really interesting. The argument is that the most valuable kind of learning, especially for complex ideas and innovation, happens through face-to-face interaction.
But surely technology, email, video calls reduces the need for that.
You'd think so, but Glazer argues the opposite. Technology is great for transmitting simple information, sure, but for really understanding nuance, for complex problem solving, for building trust, for brainstorming, face-to-face is still far superior.
Why? What does face-to-face give us?
We pick up on so much more body language, tone of voice. It allows for rapid back and forth, immediate clarification. It helps build rapport and trust, which is crucial for collaboration, especially across different disciplines or cultures where misunderstandings are easier. Remote communication can be efficient, but it's often less rich, less effective for deep learning and complex exchange.
So technology might handle the data, but face-to-face handles the understanding and trust.
That's a good way to put it. And the source argues it's this constant, often informal face-to-face interaction, the collision of ideas in dense environments that truly drives innovation and knowledge creation.
Are there examples of this?
Yes, the source gives a couple of strong ones. Think about Wall Street and financial innovation.
Right, you mentioned things like junk bonds, LBOs.
Yeah. The argument is that these complex financial products often emerge not from formal meetings, but from informal chats in coffee shops, bars, hallways, between people from different firms working in close proximity in the financial district. Ideas get shared, challenged, combined in spontaneous ways that just don't happen as easily when people are dispersed.
And the fashion industry, too.
Another classic example. Manhattan's fashion scene thrives on that dense ecosystem. Designers, buyers, manufacturers, marketers are all bumping into each other, seeing trends on the street, borrowing ideas, blending styles. It's a rapid-fire exchange fueled by proximity and diversity. The source even mentions shows like Friends or Sex and the City as cultural reflections of this urban dynamic of interaction and influence.
So far from making cities obsolete, technology has maybe even increased the value of face-to-face interaction that cities excel at facilitating, because the world is more complex now.
That's exactly the argument. The more complex the world, the more information flying around, the more valuable, clear, nuanced, trust-based communication becomes. And cities are the best platforms we have for that kind of high-bandwidth human connection, which is essential for learning and innovation.
Wow. Okay, so summing up the benefits. Sharing allows access to amenities and specialized skills. Matching connects us with the right people and communities. And learning through face-to-face interaction drives knowledge and innovation. and all are supercharged by density.
That's the core of the triumph argument. It explains why, despite the very real challenges, cities remain such powerful magnets for people and progress.
Right, but as we know, it's not always onward and upward for every city. Some thrive, some decline. That brings us to the final part. Decline, revival, and what makes a city successful today.
Because understanding failure and success is crucial. Historically, the source notes, a city's fate was often tied to transportation.
Ports, rivers, railroads.
Exactly. Cities grew where goods and people could move easily. Early New York thrived as a port. Detroit grew with access to the Great Lakes. But when transportation technology shifted, say, when railroads became more important than canals, or later when trucking and air travel changed things again, cities whose economies were tied to the old technology could falter if they didn't adapt. Industries might move away.
And Detroit is used as a major case study of decline, right? What went wrong there, according to the source?
It points to a few key things. A heavy reliance on just one industry, the big automakers.
Lack of diversification?
Right. Also, a comparatively lower average education level in its workforce compared to some other major cities at the time. Less economic diversity, making it vulnerable when the auto industry hit trouble, and perhaps an inability to adapt, to foster new kinds of industries.
And the policy responses didn't help.
The source suggests some policies might have made things worse. As the tax base shrank, raising taxes on remaining businesses and affluent residents might have encouraged them to leave, creating a downward spiral.
Yeah.
And early urban renewal efforts often focused on just tearing down old areas and putting up new buildings. The source argues this was superficial. It addressed the physical structures, but not the underlying problem, which was a need for more human capital, more educated, skilled entrepreneurial people to start new things. They focused on buildings, not people.
That's a stark contrast to the stories of revival. Let's take New York. It had some really rough times too, didn't it, mid-century?
Oh yeah, New York faced serious decline, high crime, fiscal crisis in the 70s, people leaving, but it bounced back strongly. And the source attributes that revival largely to its inherent strengths, that incredible density, and, maybe most importantly, its immense diversity.
The immigrant population.
Yes, the source notes nearly 40% foreign-born residents. It argues this constant influx brought energy, risk-taking, new ideas, adaptability.
And where did this show up? You mentioned finance and fashion earlier.
Right. The financial innovations on Wall Street, driven by that intense interaction. The creative churn of the fashion industry, fueled by diverse influences colliding. These weren't just abstract economic forces. They were driven by the people in the city interacting, competing, collaborating, learning from each other in that dense environment. New York's revival was people-powered.
Boston's revival story is a bit different, though. What was key there?
Boston also faced industrial decline and economic hardship. But its ace in the hole, according to the source, was its unparalleled concentration of world-class universities.
Harvard, MIT, BC, BU, the list goes on.
Exactly. These institutions acted like talent factories, constantly churning out highly educated engineers, scientists, managers, entrepreneurs. And these people didn't just graduate and leave. Many stayed and founded new companies, whole new industries right there.
Like tech and biotech.
Precisely. Computers, software, consulting, biotech, financing. The source mentions firms like Wang Labs, Fidelity, BCG, Bain. They all grew out of that university ecosystem. So Boston's revival was also driven by people, but specifically by human capital, nurtured through its educational institutions.
Okay, and Chicago, a third path to revival.
Chicago's approach, as described in the source, was different again. It focused very deliberately on keeping the city affordable and attractive for both people and businesses, largely by being more permissive with development.
Less strict on historic preservation, more willing to build tall.
That seems to be the key point. Compared to, say, Paris or even parts of New York or Boston, Chicago allowed more high-density construction, even in prime locations near the lake.
And the result?
More housing supply. The source uses a comparison with San Jose, a similarly sized city, noting Chicago issued 3 times as many building permits over a period. This helped keep housing costs relatively lower than in Boston or New York, even though Chicago is a major global city.
So it attracted people by being more affordable.
Exactly. By allowing more building, it created newer, relatively cheaper places to live and work, which helped attract new talent and companies. So Chicago's revival was also about people, but facilitated by policies focused on affordability and development.
Looking across these examples, Detroit struggling, New York, Boston, Chicago, reviving the core lesson seems pretty clear.
It really does. The source hammers this home. Successful urban revival isn't fundamentally about shiny new buildings or big projects. It's about people. It's about creating the conditions that attract, retain, and empower talented, diverse, innovative people.
So good schools, safe streets, decent quality of life, opportunities for interaction and learning, reasonable costs.
All of that. Policies that focus on improving the lives and opportunities of residents, fostering education, encouraging diversity, managing costs, and leveraging the power of interaction that density provides. That's what fuels the city's long-term vitality and creativity, according to this view.
It really does seem that cities, when they focus on their human core, are incredibly resilient and powerful engines.
That's the essence of Glazer's triumph. He explicitly contrasts his view with Rousseau's, who famously called the city the abyss of the human species.
The abyss. You can't get much more negative than that.
Right. But Glazer says no, cities aren't the abyss, they're humanity's greatest invention. Why? Because they are the ultimate platform for cooperation.
Cooperation leads to triumph. How?
The logic, as summarized in the source, is simple. The more people you are near, the more you can learn from, share with, collaborate with. Density creates this incredibly rich flow of information and ideas. Close cooperation amplifies everyone's strengths. It's through this constant learning and creating, fueled by interaction in cities, that humanity evolves, innovates, and progresses. Cities benefit not just themselves, but the world.
That's a really compelling, optimistic vision, a strong counter-narrative to the usual doom and gloom about urban life. But the source does acknowledge it's not the only way to think about cities, right?
Yeah,
There are other perspectives.
absolutely. It's important to remember this is one influential viewpoint. The source rightly mentions other key thinkers, Jane Jacobs, for example.
The Death and Life of Great American Cities, a classic.
Exactly. She was very critical of some of the things Glazer might champion, like huge urban renewal projects and high-rises. She argued they often destroy the fine-grained social fabric of older, mixed-use neighborhoods. She valued lower-rise density, walkability, and the eyes on the street, that informal surveillance by neighbors, which she saw as crucial for safety and vitality. A different vision of healthy density.
So a debate even within the pro-density camp about how best to achieve it.
Definitely. And think back to slums. The source also brings in Doug Saunders and his work on rival cities. He highlights their vital role as entry points for migrants, but stresses that they need good governance, secure tenure, basic services to actually function as springboards and not just descend into chaos. That's a huge practical challenge.
Right. These other views add important complexity.
They do. They remind us that while the core argument about the power of urban density and interaction might be strong, the real-world implementation, how we build, manage, and live in cities, fairly and effectively, involves a lot of tricky details and legitimate debate.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into these ideas around the triumph of the city. We've looked at how the source challenges common criticisms, explored those core benefits of sharing, matching, and learning driven by density, and seen what distinguishes successful cities that focus on people and interaction.
It definitely gives you a new lens through which to view the cities around us.
It really does. And, as the source itself suggests, theory is one thing, but real life is always richer and more complex. Your own experience of a city is irreplaceable.
Totally. Reading about serendipitous encounters spurred by density is different from actually having one or finding that niche community you didn't know existed.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to take away. Think about your own experiences with cities. Maybe you live in one, maybe you visit often, maybe you live far away from that kind of density. How does what you see and feel, the good, the bad, the connections, the frustrations, line up with the arguments we've discussed today? What part of this conversation about the triumph of the city feels most relevant or maybe most surprising to you based on your own life? Something to mull over.